The desolate howl of the wind carried the scent of smoke across the Montana plains, as Kieran Vaughn guided his exhausted horse toward the smoldering remains of what had once been a homestead. It was the spring of 1876, and the vast emptiness of the frontier had been Kieran's only companion for nearly 3 years, since he'd left behind the memories of a failed ranch and broken promises in Texas. He squinted against the setting sun, his weathered face creasing with concern as he observed the still smoking timbers. The attack couldn't have happened more than a day ago. Raiders, most likely the kind that preyed on isolated settlers who dared to stake their claim in these untamed territories. "Easy, renegade," he murmured to his chestnut gelding as the horse nickered nervously. Something about the ruins made Kieran's spine stiffen. He'd seen burned-out homesteads before too many in his 32 years, but something pulled him forward. Drawing his Winchester rifle from its saddle holster, Kieran dismounted and approached cautiously. The structure had been modest, a single-room cabin with what appeared to be the beginnings of a barn behind it, dreams reduced to ash and charred wood. The sound was so faint he almost missed it beneath the crackling of embers, a whimper high-pitched and desperate. Kieran froze, his keen ears straining in the gathering dusk. There it was again. Not an animal, a baby. Kieran moved with renewed purpose, circling the perimeter of the destruction until he located the source of the cries. Near what must have been the back of the cabin, beneath a partially collapsed wall, lay a woman. Her body was curled protectively around a small bundle. "Hello." Kieran called, approaching carefully. "Madam," the woman stirred weakly, revealing a soot-streaked face framed by tangled auburn hair. Blood matted the side of her head, and her dress was torn and scorched. But it was her eyes that caught him, wide, green, and filled with a fierce determination that belied her broken state. "My baby," she whispered hoarsely, her arms tightening around the bundle. "Please, my Ella." Kieran knelt beside her, setting his rifle down. "I'm here to help, madam." "Name's Kieran Vaughn. I won't harm you or your child." The bundle in her arms squirmed and let out another cry. The woman attempted to sit up but collapsed with a pained gasp. "Don't move," Kieran instructed firmly. "You're hurt." "Leanna," she managed. "Leanna Edwards. They came at dawn." "My husband, Thomas, they—" Her voice broke and tears cut clean trails through the soot on her face. Kieran glanced around, seeing no sign of another survivor. The grim reality settled in his chest like a stone. "I understand," he said quietly. "Let me help you and your little one." The baby, a girl no more than 6 months old by Kieran's inexperienced estimation, had somehow escaped serious injury, though her face was smudged with ash and her cries grew more insistent. "She needs water," Leanna whispered. "Please." Kieran worked quickly, clearing away debris and assessing Leanna's injuries. A deep gash on her temple, burns along her arms where she'd shielded her baby, and from the way she winced when she tried to move, likely broken ribs. The woman needed a doctor, and the nearest town was Whiteridge, at least a day's ride away. As darkness fell completely, Kieran built a small fire at a safe distance from the ruins. He tended to Leanna's wounds as best he could with the limited supplies from his saddlebags, offering water to both mother and child. The baby quieted somewhat after drinking and accepting small pieces of softened jerky that Kieran had painstakingly prepared for her. Leanna watched with feverish eyes as Kieran awkwardly cradled her daughter, his large, calloused hands gentle but uncertain. "You have children, Mr. Vaughn?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Kieran shook his head. "No, madam, never married." "You're good with her," Leanna murmured, a hint of surprise in her tone. "Had younger siblings once," he replied simply, offering no further explanation for the past tense. As the night deepened, Kieran constructed a makeshift shelter using his bedroll and oilskin coat. He helped Leanna and Ella settle beneath it, keeping the fire stoked against the spring chill. "Why were you here?" Leanna asked as he checked her bandages once more. "Nobody comes this way, that's why Thomas chose it." Kieran met her gaze steadily. "I was heading to Wyoming. Heard there might be work on a cattle drive north." A half-truth. He'd been wandering without real purpose for longer than he cared to admit. They took everything, she whispered. Our horses' supplies. Thomas had been saving for 2 years to buy this land. Her voice caught. He was building us a real home. Try to rest, Mrs. Edwards, Kieran said gently. At first light, we'll head for Whitridge. Doctor there can tend to you properly. Call me Leanna, she replied, her eyes drifting closed as exhaustion claimed her. And thank you, Mr. Vaughn. Kieran, he corrected softly, though she was already slipping into a troubled sleep. Throughout the night, Kieran maintained his vigil, dividing his attention between keeping watch for potential dangers and monitoring Leanna's condition. The baby woke several times, and he awkwardly but effectively changed her using strips torn from his spare shirt and soothed her back to sleep. By dawn, Kieran had formulated a plan. Leanna's fever had worsened overnight, and he knew delaying medical attention wasn't an option. He fashioned a sling from his blanket to secure Ella against his chest, then carefully helped Leanna onto Renegade. Mounting behind her, he cradled her injured body against his chest while balancing the baby in the sling. Hold on, Leanna, he murmured as they set off. Just hold on. The journey to Whitridge was slow and arduous. Kieran stopped frequently to offer water and rest, acutely aware of Leanna's deteriorating condition. By mid-afternoon, she was barely conscious, mumbling incoherently about fire and her husband. Ella, remarkably, seemed to have taken to Kieran. Her tiny fists clutched at his shirt, and her blue eyes, so like her mother's, gazed up at him with a trust that squeezed something long dormant in his heart. They reached Whitridge as the sun began its descent. The small settlement consisted of a main street with essential businesses, a general store, saloon, blacksmith, and most importantly a doctor's office. Dr. Samuel Wilson was a gruff man in his 60s who had seen the worst the frontier had to offer. He took one look at Leanna and immediately directed Kieran to bring her inside. What happened? He demanded as he examined the unconscious woman. Kieran explained briefly about finding the burned homestead while awkwardly bouncing Ella, who had begun to fuss. The doctor shook his head grimly. Third raid in as many months. Likely the same gang that's been terrorizing homesteaders all through the territory. He glanced at the baby. Wife and child, are they? No, Kieran replied quickly. Just happened upon them. Name's Leanna Edwards. Said her husband was killed in the raid. Doctor. Wilson nodded. She's in bad shape. Infections set in and those ribs need binding. I'll do what I can. He eyed Kieran critically. The infant needs proper care too. There's a widow, Mrs. Harrison, who might help. Lives just past the church. Kieran hesitated, looking down at Leanna's pale face. Something in him couldn't bear to leave her. I'll stay, he decided. Just tell me what the baby needs. The doctor raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. Suit yourself, Cowboy. The next 3 days passed in a blur of anxiety and exhaustion. Kieran took up residence in a chair beside Leanna's bed, leaving only to purchase necessities for Ella and himself. Mrs. Harrison indeed proved helpful, providing guidance on caring for the infant and offering to watch her when Kieran needed rest. On the evening of the 3rd day, Leanna's fever finally broke. Kieran was dozing in the chair, Ella asleep on his chest, when a soft voice roused him. You stayed. Kieran's eyes snapped open to find Leanna watching him, her gaze clearer than it had been since he'd found her. Seemed the right thing to do, he answered simply. Leanna's eyes filled with tears as they moved to her daughter. And you've been caring for Ella. Kieran shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Harrison helped. She knows about babies. He trailed off, unsure how to explain the fierce protectiveness he'd developed for both mother and child. Thank you, Leanna whispered. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along. Dr. Wilson entered then, pleased to find his patient awake and lucid. After examining her, he declared that while she was improving, she would need several more weeks of recovery before considering travel. Where will you go? Kieran asked later as he helped Leanna sit up to eat her first real meal in days. The shadow that crossed her face told him she hadn't allowed herself to think that far ahead. I don't know, she admitted. My parents are dead. Thomas's family is back east, but we weren't on good terms. They didn't approve of him marrying me." Kieran nodded, understanding the implied class difference without needing elaboration. "No other family, a sister in California," Leanna said hesitantly. "We haven't spoken in years. She wouldn't even attend our wedding." Silence fell between them, broken only by Ella's contented gurgles as she played with a wooden spoon Kieran had carved for her. "And you?" Leanna finally asked. "Will you continue to Wyoming?" Kieran hadn't considered his own plans since finding them. The cattle drive would have departed by now, and truthfully, he felt no pull to follow. For the first time in years, he felt tethered to someone. "No rush," he said. "Thought I might stay around a while, make sure you both are settled." Relief flooded Leanna's expression, followed quickly by embarrassment. "We've already imposed on your kindness too much, Mr. Vaughn." "Kieran," he reminded her gently, "and it's no imposition." As the days passed, Leanna grew stronger, graduating from bed rest to short walks around Dr. Wilson's small garden. Kieran remained in Whiteridge, taking odd jobs to cover their expenses and spending evenings with Leanna and Ella. He found himself sharing bits of his past that he'd never spoken aloud, how he'd lost his parents to fever when he was 15, raised his younger brothers until they were grown, tried and failed to establish a ranch in Texas during the tumultuous years after the war. "What happened to your brothers?" Leanna asked one evening as they sat on the doctor's porch, watching the sunset. Ella was asleep in a cradle that the town's carpenter had gifted them, one of many gestures of kindness from the community. Kieran's jaw tightened. "Michael died at Shiloh." Confederate side. "Patrick headed to California after the war. Haven't heard from him in 8 years. Leanna's hand found his where it rested on the porch railing. "I'm sorry." Her touch sent warmth through him that had nothing to do with the lingering heat of the day. Kieran had deliberately avoided entanglements with women over the years, convinced that the nomadic life he'd chosen left no room for attachments. Yet here he was, finding excuses to stay in Whiteridge day after day. It wasn't just obligation or duty. When Leanna smiled, something she did more frequently now, it lit something inside him that he'd thought long extinguished. By the time Leanna was fully recovered, nearly 6 weeks had passed. She had taken to helping Mrs. Harrison with sewing work, earning a modest income that she insisted on using to repay Kieran for his expenses. "You don't owe me anything," he'd protested. "It's not about owing," she'd explained. "It's about standing on my own feet again, for Ella's sake." Kieran understood pride. It was one of the few possessions he'd never relinquished in his years of wandering. He respected Leanna's determination to rebuild her life, even as he wondered what role, if any, he might play in that future. The question was answered unexpectedly one afternoon when Sheriff James Dawson rode into town with news that turned Whiteridge on its head. "They caught the Sullivan gang," he announced to the gathered townspeople outside the general store. "Army patrol ran them down near the Montana-Wyoming border." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The Sullivan gang had been terrorizing the territory for months, responsible for numerous raids on isolated homesteads, including, Kieran realized with a jolt, the attack that had claimed Thomas Edwards's life. "Those that survived are being brought to Fort Kearny for trial," the sheriff continued. "Anyone with claims against them should be prepared to testify." Kieran found Leanna at Mrs. Harrison's, her face pale as she absorbed the news he'd brought. "I should go," she said quietly after ensuring Ella was napping. "I need to see justice done for Thomas." "It's a 4-day journey to Fort Kearny," Kieran pointed out, "with a baby." Leanna's chin lifted with the stubborn determination he'd come to admire. "I know, but I have to do this, Kieran. I have to look them in the eye," he understood. Closure was a precious commodity on the frontier, where life was often cut short without warning or explanation. "Then I'm coming with you," he said simply, her eyes widened. "You've already done so much, I'm coming," he repeated firmly. "We'll leave tomorrow." The journey to Fort Kearny was challenging but manageable. Kieran had purchased a wagon and a team of horses using his savings, outfitting it with supplies and a makeshift canopy to shelter Leanna and Ella from the elements. They traveled steadily, stopping each night to make camp. On their third evening on the trail, as they sat beside the campfire after Ella had fallen asleep, Leanna broke a comfortable silence. "What happens after the trial?" Kieran poked at the fire with a stick. "What do you want to happen?" She was quiet for a long moment. "I've been thinking about that land, our land." She glanced up at him. "It's still mine. The deed is in both our names and I have the papers." "You want to go back?" Kieran couldn't hide his surprise. Leanna nodded slowly. "Not to the same spot, I couldn't, but it's good land. Thomas chose it carefully. There's a creek on the north edge that never runs dry, even in summer." She took a deep breath. "I want Ella to have a home, not a life of drifting." Kieran understood the implied question beneath her words. "It's hard country for a woman alone," he said carefully. "I know." Her eyes met his, unwavering. "I'm not asking for promises, Kieran. You've done more than anyone could expect, but—" She hesitated. "If you wanted somewhere to stop wandering for a while, there's room enough for a cabin, and more." The offer hung in the air between them, weighted with possibilities that Kieran had never allowed himself to consider. Before he could respond, Ella's cry broke the moment, and Leanna rose to tend to her daughter. That night, as he took the first watch, Kieran contemplated the future that Leanna had tentatively proposed: a home, land, a family perhaps, though neither had spoken of deeper feelings. It was pragmatic. Partnerships were common on the frontier, where survival often depended on mutual support, but Kieran sensed there was more beneath the surface. For himself, he could no longer deny that his feelings for Leanna had grown far beyond the initial protectiveness he'd felt. Her strength, her dedication to Ella, her quiet dignity in the face of devastating loss all had awakened emotions he'd long suppressed. The trial at Fort Kearney was brief, but intense. 3 members of the Sullivan gang had survived their encounter with the Army Patrol, including Jeb Sullivan himself, a notorious outlaw with a reputation for particular cruelty. Leanna testified with composure, describing the dawn attack that had claimed her husband and destroyed their home. Kieran sat with Ella in the back of the makeshift courtroom, his presence a silent support as Leanna recounted the trauma she'd endured. When Sullivan was sentenced to hang, along with his remaining men, Leanna shed no tears. "It won't bring Thomas back," she said quietly as they left the fort. "But perhaps it will prevent other families from suffering the same fate." They spent one night in the small settlement that had grown around Fort Kearney before beginning the journey back toward Montana territory. As they traveled, something shifted between them, a new ease, as if a burden had been lifted. On their second evening, after making camp near a small stream, Kieran finally found the words he'd been turning over in his mind. "I've been thinking about your offer," he began as they sat side by side, watching Ella play with the carved wooden horse he'd made for her. "About the land." Leanna looked up, her expression carefully neutral. "And I'd like to accept if you're still willing." He cleared his throat. "But I need to be honest about something." She waited, her green eyes steady on his face. "These past weeks with you and Ella, they've meant more to me than I know how to say." Kieran forced himself to continue despite the unaccustomed vulnerability. "I haven't felt like I belonged anywhere or to anyone in a very long time, but with you both, I do." Leanna's breath caught. "Kieran, I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give," he hastened to add. "I know you're still grieving Thomas. But if you'll have me, I'd like to build something with you, for Ella, for us." Tears welled in Leanna's eyes, but her smile was radiant. "I've been afraid to admit it, even to myself," she confessed. "It felt like betraying Thomas's memory to have these feelings for you so soon after losing him." She reached for his hand. "But life is too uncertain out here to deny what's in my heart." Kieran entwined his fingers with hers. "And what is in your heart, Leanna Edwards?" "Hope," she whispered. "For the first time since that terrible morning, real hope. And something else that's growing stronger every day." The distance between them closed, and their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a promise rather than a demand. When they parted, Ella's delighted giggle brought matching smiles to their faces. "She approves," Kieran murmured. They returned to Whiteridge to gather their few possessions and bid farewell to the friends who had supported them. Dr. Wilson gave them additional medical supplies. Mrs. Harrison prepared a basket of preserves and a quilt for Ella, and the townspeople collected a modest fund to help them rebuild. "We've chosen a spot about 15 miles northeast of the original homestead," Kieran explained to Sheriff Dawson, "near the junction of Elk Creek and the Little Powder River. Good water, good grazing." The sheriff nodded approvingly. "Smart choice. I'll make a note of your location. Try to swing by when I'm patrolling that area." Their new beginning was not without challenges. They arrived at the chosen site in early summer, with just enough time to construct a sturdy cabin before winter set in. Kieran worked from dawn until dusk, his skills as a carpenter honed during his ranching days in Texas proving invaluable. Leanna proved to be a capable partner, managing their supplies, caring for Ella, and even helping with the construction when possible. By September, they had a snug one-room cabin with a stone fireplace and plans for expansion in the spring. "It's not much," Kieran said apologetically as they stood outside their completed home, Ella balanced on his hip. The child, now nearly a year old, had taken to calling him Key in her limited vocabulary. "It's everything," Leanna corrected him, her eyes shining. "It's ours." That evening, after Ella was asleep in her corner cradle, Kieran took Leanna's hand and led her outside to the porch he'd built along the front of the cabin. The autumn sky stretched above them, brilliant with stars. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. "I've been saving for the right moment." He pulled out a simple gold band purchased in Whiteridge before their departure with the last of his savings. "I know we haven't spoken of marriage directly," he said, suddenly nervous. "And if it's too soon," Leanna silenced him with a kiss. "It's not too soon," she whispered against his lips. "Ask me, Kieran Vaughn." He dropped to one knee, the ring held between them. "Leanna Edwards, will you marry me? Will you let me be a father to Ella and a husband to you for all the days we have?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes to all of it." They were married 2 weeks later by a traveling preacher who stopped at their homestead on his circuit. The ceremony was simple, just the three of them and the vast Montana sky as witness, but filled with genuine joy. That winter tested their resolve as all frontier winters did, with blizzards that isolated them for weeks and temperatures that froze the creek solid. But inside their cabin, warmed by the fireplace and their growing love, they created a haven of security and happiness. Kieran officially adopted Ella, who flourished under the care of 2 devoted parents. By spring, when the snow melted and new grass carpeted the plains, Leanna shared news that completed their family's transformation. She was expecting a child. "Are you happy?" she asked as they stood together, watching Ella toddle after a butterfly in the meadow beside their expanded cabin. Kieran drew her into his arms, his hand resting protectively over the slight swell of her belly. "Happier than I ever thought possible," he answered honestly. 3 years ago, I was just a lonely cowboy with nowhere to belong. Now I have everything a man could want." "We found each other in the ashes," Leanna murmured. "Something beautiful from something terrible." "That's the way of the frontier," Kieran replied. "Hardship and beauty side by side." As the seasons passed, their homestead flourished. A son joined their family, Thomas Kieran Vaughn, named in honor of the past and the future. Kieran acquired cattle and horses, establishing a modest but successful ranch. Leanna planted an orchard and a kitchen garden, taught Ella her letters, and became known in the growing community for her healing skills, learned from Dr. Wilson. 5 years after that fateful day when Kieran had found a baby crying in the ashes beside the mother he didn't yet know he needed, they stood together on their porch, watching their children play in the yard of the home they had built together. "Do you ever wonder what might have happened if you'd taken a different trail that day?" Leanna asked, leaning against his shoulder. Kieran shook his head. I believe some trails find us, not the other way around. He turned to face her, cupping her cheek in his hand. And I'm grateful every day for the one that led me to you. In the vast expanse of the Montana Territory, where life was often harsh and uncertain, they had forged something rare and precious. A love born from tragedy, tempered by challenges and strengthened by shared purpose. What had begun in the ashes of destruction had become a testament to resilience, hope, and the enduring power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. As the sun set behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Kieran Vaughn, no longer the lonely cowboy but a husband, father, and rancher with deep roots in the land, gathered his family close, knowing that he had finally found his true home.